Good evening and welcome to Story Time. My name is Charlie Malone, and every week I share a story with you that's near and dear to my heart. And as you can see from the tree twinkling in the background, today is Christmas Day, and it's come to that part of the day I have a quiet moment to myself, and I wanted to share a few stories with you. I'm going to share one that's not explicitly about Christmas, doesn't talk about Christmas, but its theme of generosity and gift giving and caring about each other is very strong, and I think it's appropriate. There's not many pictures in this book, so I'll just read it, and if there's a picture comes up, I'll share it with you. The Shoemaker and the Elves. Once upon a time, there was a shoemaker who, one day, through no fault of his own, found himself so poor that all he had left in the world was enough leather for one last pair of shoes. That evening he cut the leather to size, since he wanted to take up work on the shoes the next morning. And then, with a good conscience, he got into bed, prayed for the dear Lord's grace, and fell asleep. In the morning he said his prayers and was about to sit down to work when he saw the shoes lying finished on his workbench. He was amazed and did not know what to say. He picked up the shoes to take a closer look. So finely were they crafted, without a single stitch out of place, that they looked to him just like a masterpiece. A moment later, a customer walked in who loved the shoes so much that he paid more than the usual price for them. With this money, the shoemaker was able to buy enough leather for 2 pairs of shoes. He cut the patterns for them that evening and planned to get to work on them the next morning. But there was no need, for when he got up, the shoes were already finished. Soon customers came and paid him so much money that he could now buy enough leather for 4 pairs of shoes. First thing the next morning, he found these 4 pairs finished, and so this went on. Whatever he sized up, in the evening was finished by morning. Soon enough, he was making a good living again, and in time became a prosperous man. Now one such evening, not long before Christmas, when he'd finished cutting the leather just before bed, he said to his wife, "How about we stay up tonight to see who on earth has been lending us such a helping hand?" His wife loved the idea and lit a lamp, and then they hid in the corner behind the clothes hanging there and kept watch. At the stroke of midnight, 2 little, bare-naked men came and sat down at the shoemaker's bench. They took the cut leather and began to work. Their tiny fingers were so deft and fast at punching the holes, stitching, and hammering that the astonished shoemaker and his wife could not take their eyes off them. The 2 little elves did not let up until everything was done, and the shoes lay finished on the workbench. Then they hurried off. The next morning, the shoemaker's wife said, "These little elves have made us wealthy, and we should show our gratitude. They're running around here with nothing to wear, and they must be freezing cold when they get outside. You know what I'm going to do? I'll knit some little shirts, coats, vests, and pants and shoes for them, and for each a pair of stockings. And why don't you make them some tiny shoes?" "That's a great idea," her husband said. And in the evening, when they'd finished everything, instead of the next day's leather, they laid their gifts out on the workbench. Then they hid once again, hoping to see what the little elves would do. At midnight, they came bounding in, ready to get down to work. But instead of leather for their shoemaking, they found darling little clothes laid out for them. At first they were puzzled, but then they jumped for joy, and as fast as they could, they got dressed and straightened their new garments out with their hands, singing, "Aren't we fellows so neat and smooth? Let's quit shoemaking and make a new move. Aren't we fellows so neat and so smooth? Let's quit shoemaking and make a new move." Here's the picture. I love this picture. So the shoemaker and his wife are hiding right there, and the 2 little elves find the clothes, and they're very excited. Then they hopped and danced around the room, leaping over the chairs and the bench, until at last they danced on their way merrily out the door. From then on they never returned, but the shoemaker continued to prosper, succeeding at everything he put his hands to, and he and his wife lived happily ever after. Thanks for listening to that story with me. Now, the next story that I share is from Hans Christian Andersen. And the big difference between the Brothers Grimm folk tales and Hans Christian Andersen is that the Brothers Grimm went around collecting folk tales from people, stories that they had heard or that people had heard that they told and then told to the Brothers Grimm. Hans Christian Andersen wrote all of his stories, and he came up with them in his mind and his heart, and he wrote them down. So they're original stories that started with him, even though if he drew upon other stories that he had heard himself. And the story that I want to tell you tonight is a very sad story, because it's about a girl who, well, why don't I just read the story? It's called The Little Match Girl. It too doesn't have very many pictures, and so the best thing to do is to make the pictures in your own mind, or make the pictures together with somebody else while you listen to the story. It was dreadfully cold. Snow was falling. Soon it would be quite dark. It was also the very last evening of the year, New Year's Eve. In this cold and darkness, a poor little girl was wandering along with bare head and bare feet. It's true that she had slippers on when she left home, but what good was that? They were great big things, those slippers. They had belonged to her mother, so it's not surprising that they had fallen off when she scurried across the road, just missing two carts that were thundering past. One slipper was nowhere to be found, and a boy ran off for the other. It would do for a cradle when he had children of his own, he called out teasingly. So there was the little girl treading along on naked feet that were quite blue with cold. In an old apron she carried a pile of matches, and she held one bunch of them in her hand. She had sold nothing the whole of the day. No one had given her a single penny for any of the matches. Hungry and frozen, she trudged along looking miserable. Poor little thing. The snowflakes fell on her long hair, which curled so prettily at her neck. But she certainly wasn't thinking about her looks. Lights were shining in every window, and wonderful smells of roasting goose drifted down the street, for it was New Year's Eve, remember, and that's what she was thinking about. In a sheltered corner between two houses, one jutting out a little farther than the other, she crouched down and huddled herself together, tucking up her legs. But this didn't really help. She just grew colder and colder. She didn't dare go home, for she had sold no matches. She hadn't a single copper coin to bring back, so her father would be very angry and upset. Besides, her home was freezing too. It was an attic under the roof, and the wind whistled through that, though the worst cracks had been stuffed with straw and rags. Her hands were quite numb with cold. A match flame would be such a comfort. Oh, if only she dared to strike one match, just one. She took one and struck it against the wall. How it crackled and blazed. What a lovely, warm, clear flame, just like a little candle. She held her hand around it. Really, it was a wonderful light. The little girl seemed to be sitting in front of a big iron stove with shining brass knobs and fittings. Inside was such a warm, friendly fire. Oh, what had happened? She had just put out her toes to warm them too when the flame went out. The stove had gone. She was sitting in the cold with the stump of a burned-out matchstick in her hand. She struck another match. It flared up brightly. Where it shone, the wall became transparent as gauze. She could see right into the room, where the table was laid with a shining starched white cloth, and on it were dishes of the finest porcelain. A delicious hot fragrance rose from a roast goose stuffed with prunes and apples. The goose seemed nearer and nearer, almost as if she could taste it. She could almost touch it. Then the match went out. All she could see and feel was the cold and unfriendly wall. She struck another. Now she was sitting under the loveliest of Christmas trees, even bigger and more beautifully decorated than the great tree she had seen at Christmas through the glass door of the rich merchant's shop. Thousands of candles were alight on its branches, and brightly colored Christmas pictures, just like the ones in all the shop windows, were looking down at her kindly. The little girl reached out her hands, and then the match burned out. But the flames from the candles seemed to rise higher and higher, and she saw that they were stars in the heavens high above. One of them rushed across, leaving a fiery streak in the dark night sky. "Someone's dying," said the little girl. Her grandmother, now dead, the only person who had ever been kind to her, had told her once that whenever a star falls, it is a sign that a soul is going to heaven. She struck another match on the wall. As it lit up the blackness all around, she saw in its bright glow her dear grandmother's face. How sweet she looked, so loving and so kind. "Granny, take me with you," she cried. "I know you'll disappear when the match goes out, just like the warm stove and the roast goose and the wonderful Christmas tree." And without stopping, she struck all the rest of the matches in the bundle. Her grandmother must not go. The flames shone out so brilliantly that all around was even brighter than daylight. Never before had her grandmother looked so tall and beautiful. She took the little girl in her arms and flew with her in joy and splendor, up and up to where there was no cold, no fear, no hunger, no suffering, up to heaven. In the cold early morning, huddled in a corner, there sat the little girl, with red cheeks and smiling lips, frozen to death on the last night of the old year. The new year dawned on the little dead body with its lapful of matches. One bundle was burned out. She was trying to warm herself, people said. No one knew what lovely things she had seen, and how gloriously she had flown with her grandmother into her own new year. I hope you enjoyed that story. Have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And as always, talk to people around you about the stories that I read. Share them with other people. Until next time, bye-bye.